and to work through a series of progressively deep levels of doubt. So the first thing he does is just point out that sometimes our senses deceive us. That's kind of a limited level of doubt. Sometimes our senses don't tell us the truth or don't get us to believe true things. He then goes to a somewhat deeper level, raising the question of whether we're able or how we're able to tell that we're awake, that we're not having a particularly lively dream in which we're experiencing something just like what we would experience if we were awake. But even that isn't enough for his purposes, so he goes even deeper, and he imagines a scenario in which we're completely fooled by an evil demon. And in that scenario, everything has been doubted, and at that point he wonders, is there anything left? And he realizes that if he doubts everything, he's at least thinking. If he's thinking, then he must exist. So this is what's usually called the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Those words actually don't appear in the Meditations, they're somewhere else, but nevertheless the thought appears there, the argument. Reflecting upon the cogito, he comes up with, in effect, a criterion in a sense, I think, the right, a little bit like what the Pyrrhonian skeptic is concerned about, a criterion by which you can tell that you know something, or at least that your beliefs are indubitable. It's the criterion of clear and distinct ideas. And then he uses this to prove the existence of God, and the existence of God to prove that clear and distinct ideas are true, which is to argue in a circle. So I'll get to that at the end of the hour. Now, Descartes, 17th century thinker, absolutely pivotal figure in the history of philosophy. When I was learning the subject, he was always called the father of modern philosophy. That's perhaps a little bit politically incorrect, so maybe it should be one of the founding figures, but one of the key figures in the tradition, not just a philosopher. He was actively engaged in mathematics. He worked in physics, did dissections, worked in biology. He was one of these thinkers of the kind we no longer have, who seemed to do a lot of different work, and his philosophy was bound up with this science. Famous ideas in philosophy that are associated with Descartes are the cogito, that I think, therefore I am. Also something that I won't address explicitly, but seems to be assumed at a certain point in the discussion, is the position that's called Cartesian dualism. This is the view in the philosophy of mind, a dualist view according to which there are two separate substances. It's not just that mind and body are two aspects of the same thing, they're different substances. And so you get this real dualism where the mind and the body are distinct things, and how are they ever going to interact is an issue. So he's associated with a strong dualist position, and also with important arguments for the existence of God. One called the ontological argument, I won't be talking about, but is found later in the Meditations. I've assigned the first couple of Meditations, and I'll talk a little bit about some bits later in the Meditations. Now, I've said he uses skepticism as a method. This is sometimes called the method of hyperbolic doubt. That just means exaggerated doubt that you're not supposed to take seriously. He uses this method of doubt, and what this does is this generates a kind of a radical or extreme skepticism about the external world. But he's not, in fact, attempting to establish skepticism. He's using skepticism for non-skeptical, for anti-skeptical purposes. He's actually trying to identify the basis of knowledge, and he's using skepticism to do that. So what he does is he tries to doubt everything. This is effectively his technique, to figure out a way of doubting everything, raise maximal doubt, and as a result of trying to doubt everything, what he then does is discover that there is something that you can't doubt, right? So by trying to doubt everything, he discovers something that's indubitable, and that's going to be the basis for knowledge. So this use of his method of doubt, well, that's led him in the end to figure out basically what certainty is. And he, as I read Descartes, is taking indubitability and certainty to be virtually the same thing. We'll see next time when I talk about fallibilism that you might challenge the connection between indubitability and certainty. Now, as I say, Descartes works through these increasing levels of doubt, starting with pointing out sensory error, considering the dream scenario, and then this evil demon scenario that he considers. Now, before I get into this, let's just sort of briefly have a sense of what he's trying to do, what the job is, what the task, the project is that he's undertaking. So this is the beginning of the meditations. He says, "Some years ago I was struck by the large number of falsehoods that I had accepted as true in my childhood, and by the highly doubtful nature of the whole edifice that I had subsequently based on them. I realized that it was necessary, once in the course of my life, to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundations if I wanted to establish anything at all in the sciences that was stable and likely to last." I'm going to longer quote in a moment, but notice already a couple of things. We have the idea of an edifice. I spoke about this some weeks ago in trying to illustrate foundationalism. So we've got this foundationalist metaphor. And we do have a sense of what he's trying to do. He's like to establish something that has, in the sciences, that's likely to be, is going to be stable and likely to last. So I guess the thought is that he's looking for something that's, that is not some way of establishing beliefs that are not going to be thrown over immediately. They're going to be stable and likely to last. That may explain why he's interested in indubitability. If things can't be doubted, then perhaps they're stable and likely to last. But in order to do this, to accomplish this, he says, it will not be necessary for me to show that all my opinions are false, which is something I could perhaps never manage. Reason now leads me to think that I should hold back my assent, right? This is like withholding belief, just like this, the Pyrrhonians. I should hold back my assent from opinions which are not completely certain and indubitable, just as carefully as I do from those which are patently false. So for the purpose of rejecting all my opinions, it will be enough if I find in each of them some reason for doubt. And to do this, I'll not need to run through them all individually, which will be an endless task. Once the foundations of a building are undermined, right, we're using the foundationalist image, anything built on them collapses of its own accord. So I'll go straight for the basic principles on which all my former beliefs rested. So what we have is something that this philosophical enterprise he's undertaking, this philosophical job he's doing in the meditations, is because he wants to establish something that's likely to last in the sciences. And he thinks that in order to do that, he's got to tear down this edifice of beliefs that are doubtful. He thinks he's built up a whole set of beliefs that are doubtful, and he thinks he has to tear this down. And what he's going to do is to try to rebuild his beliefs, this edifice, basically, from new foundations. Now, why do you think he has to sort of tear it down? And why can't he just, why does he have to do what he does and go for the foundations? Why can't he just sort of take each belief by itself and examine it, work out whether it's true or false, and then chuck it out? That might be a procedure. Well, he doesn't think, I take it he doesn't think that's feasible. But what he proposes to do, rather than individually examine all of his beliefs, determine whether they're any good, and get rid of them if they're not any good, he works with the foundational conception of knowledge, which means that he's able to sort of go for the foundations. The foundations of his belief system, his edifice of knowledge, were insecure. They were falsehoods that he'd taken on when he was young. And so he knew that the rest of the system of belief was doubtful. And so he thinks he can knock out he can go for the foundations, try to knock them out to tear the edifice down. But at the same time, by doing that, he's actually working to identify the foundations of knowledge. By challenging the foundations of his belief system, this is part of the process whereby he's going to be identifying the real sort of basic elements, the things that he could be certain of. So with that as sort of a description of what he's trying to do, let's now look at his method of doubt and start with his first level of doubt, which is just the point that sometimes our senses lead us astray. Whatever I've up until now accepted as most true, I've acquired either from the senses or through the senses. So he's beginning by thinking about sense experience. He thinks that's the first place to consider. But from time to time, I've found that the senses deceive, and it's prudent never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. From time to time, we've found that the senses deceive us, and it's prudent never to trust completely those who've deceived us even once. Yet although the senses occasionally deceive us with respect to objects which are very small or in the distance, there are many other beliefs about which doubt is impossible, even though they are derived from the senses. For example, that I'm here, sitting by the fire, wearing a winter dressing gown, holding this piece of paper in my hands, and so on. So he's making a limited claim. This is, at this point, this is a preliminary. It only goes for a couple sentences, right? He's just warming up. This is not the claim that our senses are radically mistaken. This is just the claim that sometimes our senses are mistaken. He suggests that because sometimes our senses lead us astray, we shouldn't trust them completely, but he's not saying this is a reason to believe that we should not trust our senses at all. So this is a quite restricted point. He's not going for external world skepticism at this point. He's just pointing out that sometimes our senses deceive us. And he's not by any means trying at this point to suggest that they always do, because he says not just that sometimes our senses deceive us, but then he goes on to say there are cases where it's impossible for us to doubt our senses. And what he's thinking of there are cases of immediate experience. He's suggesting that in cases of immediate experience, we can't doubt our senses. And the example he gives is that he can't doubt that he's sitting by the fire, wearing a winter dressing gown, holding this piece of paper in his hand. That's the kind of thing he's going to throw into doubt in a moment. But at this stage, he's saying it's impossible to doubt some of these immediate experiences. So at this point, he said, sometimes our senses deceive us, but there are also cases where it's impossible to doubt what our senses tell us. So quite limited. And if you think about it further, you'll realize that this has to be a limited point. Because what he's saying is that we can actually tell that some of the time our senses deceive us, right? We know that some of the time our senses deceive us. How do you find out that some of the time our senses deceive us? Well, think about something that we saw in Sextus yesterday. A stick that's put in water and appears half bent, and you can determine by using your senses that the stick is actually straight. By pulling it out and looking at it or putting your hand on it, there's various ways of checking to see whether your senses got it right. So you can actually use your senses, which are working properly, to show that your senses have sometimes deceived you. So in order to even show that your senses sometimes deceive you, you have to, in a sense, diagnose that against the background in which, by and large, your senses aren't deceiving you. You wouldn't be able to find out that your senses deceive you some of the time if, at least some of the time, your senses weren't deceiving you, because that's exactly how you discover that your senses are deceiving you. Right? You can check some cases where your senses are giving you erroneous information by means of other cases where they're not. So there's a sense in which this first point presupposes that our senses, at least some of the time, work, because we're using our senses to discover that sometimes our senses don't tell us the truth. It's even... He may even go just a little tiny bit too far when he says, because our senses occasionally deceive us, it's prudent never to trust completely those who've deceived us even once. He may be going just a little bit far, because it could be that there are certain circumstances where our senses do deceive us. And there are other sets of circumstances where they don't. And so the fact that our senses deceive us in certain circumstances might give us reason not to trust them there. but might not have any implication about the other circumstances, right? So it could be that we have no reason not to completely trust our senses in a certain set of circumstances, even though there are certain circumstances where they do. So he may actually, despite this being a limited point, he may almost overstate it. Still, it's a preliminary thing. He's just loosening things up. And now he wants to go on from the point that sometimes our senses get things wrong. Sometimes we make errors based on sensory perception. He wants to go on now to challenge specific sensory experiences, to challenge us to show that we know that they're actually veridical, that they're actually leading us to form true beliefs. And the way he does this is not to just consider that sometimes our senses get it wrong, but to ask us to consider the distinction or the relationship between dreaming and waking experience. The rough idea is that you can have a dream that's very vivid and very difficult to distinguish with respect to the nature of the experience from an experience you'd have when you were awake. This problem of being able to distinguish being awake from being asleep is a challenge, a stronger challenge to sense experience. And in fact, it does something that the first level of doubt doesn't do. Because in the first level, he said there are some things you can't doubt, right? He said, he can't doubt that I'm here sitting by the fire wearing his dressing gown and all that. But that actually could be doubted by the dream scenario, because he could be dreaming that he's sitting in front of the fire, right? So this is a more extreme case, and here he is. How often, asleep at night, am I convinced of just such familiar events? That I'm here in my dressing gown sitting by the fire, when in fact I'm lying undressed in bed. Yet at the moment my eyes are certainly wide awake. When I look at this piece of paper, I shake my head and it's not asleep. As I stretch out and feel my hand, I do so deliberately, and I know what I'm doing. All this would not happen with such distinctness to someone asleep. Indeed, as if I did not remember other occasions when I have been tricked by exactly similar thoughts while asleep. As I think about this more carefully, I see plainly, and this is the line I always emphasize, that there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. Result is that I begin to feel dazed, and this very feeling only reinforces the notion that I may be asleep. So he's considered how you could tell being awake from being asleep, and the claim he's made is there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. And I take it that by a sure sign, he means a test of some kind. So the claim is that there's no test that you could conduct that would show you that you're awake as opposed to being asleep. So the kind of tests that I think of are shaking your head or pinching yourself. These are tests that you can conduct. You could pinch yourself to prove that you're awake. The problem is you can pinch yourself when you're asleep. You can be dreaming that you're pinching yourself. So pinching yourself doesn't show that you're awake because you might be dreaming that you're pinching yourself. So that test is something you could dream to actually happen. So it doesn't seem to be capable of showing us that we're awake. It doesn't seem to be able to show us then that when we're having an experience, we know it's a genuine experience rather than a dreamed experience. Now, this does generate deeper doubt than the mere point that sometimes our senses get it wrong, because what it does is, with respect to any particular experience we're having, so for example, the experience you're having at this very moment, it raises a question about how you can tell that that experience is a genuine experience that you're having while you're awake, or whether it's a non-veridical experience or an illusory experience that you're having while you're asleep. So in any particular case, the question is how you can tell you're not dreaming in that case. And so this is, applies to all levels of experience, including immediate experience that you're having of the phenomena, the facts, the objects right in front of you. The thought is, if you can't tell that you're not dreaming now, then you can't tell that your sense experience is providing you with the truth about the world. Nevertheless, this is still somewhat limited. It's not a wholesale illusion. It's not the kind of radical illusion that he's working up to. It shows us that particular experiences may be such that we can't tell whether they're illusory or not, but it doesn't show us that all of our experiences are illusory, right? It's only saying, how can you tell that this particular experience you're having right now is real, is a genuine experience rather than a dreamed experience? How can you tell with respect to some experience that it's not a dreamed experience? But it's not claiming that we're always asleep or always dreaming, right? The fact that you can't tell with respect to some particular experience whether it's genuine or not doesn't mean that we're subject to a wholesale illusion. There's a way that this point is put by philosopher Bernard Williams. He says that the way to think about the limitation of the dream argument turns on the distinction between any and all. He points out that you can say anyone can be below average height, and that intuitively seems to be true, that any particular person might be or have been below average height. But the fact that anyone can be below average height doesn't entail that everyone can be below average height. That doesn't make any sense, right? Everyone, any particular person could have been below average height, but not everyone at the same time could have been below average height, because then, there wouldn't be something going wrong with the averages there. And analogously, any perception may be illusory, right? Any particular perception may be illusory. Doesn't mean the same thing as all perception may be illusory, right? So this is the limitation of this scenario is that what it's getting us to see is that any particular perception we're having could be an illusion, but that doesn't entail that all of our perceptions can be or are an illusion. There's a further limit that Descartes mentions just as he's finishing off the description of the discussion of the dream scenario. It's a way in which the dream scenario is limited in the way that the evil demon scenario isn't. Because what he points out is that our dreams pretty much have contents that are sort of available in everyday life and then kind of reassembled in our dreams. He talks about the dreams having lots of general kinds of things which are there in reality, and that in our dreams we just sort of put them together in different ways. So here's Descartes on this. The visions which come in sleep are like paintings, which must have been fashioned in the likeness of things that are real, and hence at least these general kinds of things, eyes, heads, hands, and body as a whole, are things which are not imaginary, but are real and exist. For even when painters try to create sirens and satyrs with the most extraordinary bodies, they cannot give them natures which are new in all respects. They simply jumble up the limbs of different animals. So this is a further limitation on the dream scenario because it's working with, in a sense, real things and just playing around with them, reassembling them in different ways. And that's a further thing that gets thrown into doubt in the final sort of level of doubt. Now, I want to say one last thing about the dream scenario. I only had you read the first couple meditations. In the sixth meditation, Descartes actually solves the dream scenario, responds to the dream argument in a way that a lot of people find compelling. This is basically the idea that our experiences in waking life are continuously connected together in a way that they aren't when we're asleep. And he says, dreams are never linked by memory with all the other actions of life as waking experiences are. So in our waking experiences, we have memories that kind of connect up our current experiences with earlier ones. And his thought is that that's characteristic of waking experience, that there's this kind of connection between experiences which memory sort of sees. And dreams, by contrast, don't have the connection. They're a bunch of disconnected events, and they don't have this kind of connection that we're able to see by remembering earlier events and showing how one event led to another. Now, that does seem intuitively to be a difference between at least my dreams and my waking life. and I assume other people's as well. It's not obvious, though, that it actually is a successful objection or response to dream argument, because it's not obvious that you'd be unable to dream, have the experience in your dream of your dream being continuous, or seeming to have one event flow into another. But another way, you might actually dream that you're having a memory of earlier events which led up to current events. So it's not obvious that you couldn't be dreaming this thing that he thinks is capable of distinguishing being awake from being asleep. Not sure how persuasive that is, but the comeback to Descartes' point is, couldn't you just have dreamt that, or be dreaming that? In any event, I want now to look at the more extreme level of doubt, which is the evil demon scenario. In the modern way of putting these things, this would be the brain in the vat scenario that you get in The Matrix and Hilary Putnam and other people. But this is the older sort of Cartesian version of it. And what he's doing is he's going beyond these two preliminary levels of doubt, the mere point that our senses sometimes lead us astray, the more extreme point that it's hard to distinguish, or that we may not be able to distinguish being awake from being asleep in any particular instance. But he needs a more extreme level of doubt for his purposes, because what he's looking for is something that's fundamentally impossible to be doubted. And so he really has to throw everything into question. Once everything is doubted, then if there's anything that can't be doubted at that point, then that's going to be what he really places all the weight on. So here's the scenario. Some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the illusion of dreams which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. I shall consider myself as not having hands or eyes or flesh or blood or senses, but as falsely believing that I have all these things. Everything I see is spurious. My memory tells me lies, and none of the things that it reports ever happened. I have no senses, right? It's not just that my senses mislead me. I have no senses, right? You have no body, and so no senses. Body, shape, extension, movement, and place are all chimeras, or chimeras. All right, so these things that were still there in the dream, well, they're not there in this scenario. The most fundamental aspects of reality are gone by assumption, right? There's no color, no shape, sound. There's no body, there's no shape, there's no extension, there's no extended bodies, there's no movement. So this is the extreme level of doubt in which you take everything that you can possibly consider doubting, and he's constructed a scenario in which it's all some kind of great, big, huge illusion. On this scenario, our experience is fundamentally erroneous. There is no external world. We have no body. Nothing that we remember actually happened. Our senses don't even exist. So any experience we have is just basically completely mistaken. We don't have bodies. There are no bodies, right? So any experience we have of our body is a mistake. There aren't any external objects. So anything that we think exists outside of our minds, chairs, other people, the earth, they just don't exist. And it's not just that particular items, like particular chairs, don't exist, but general things that could be had by different things, right? Two chairs can be blue. Well, color doesn't exist. Motion doesn't exist. It's a pretty extreme scenario. It's not just that these external things don't exist. We don't have senses. Our memory is completely erroneous, right? So he's stripped things back as extremely as he can. And now the question is, what is possible to know in such extreme circumstances? And at this point, basically though he doesn't use these exact words in the Meditations, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. right? There is something about which you can be certain, something you can know, even under the assumption of this massive illusion. He says, I've convinced myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Does it now follow that I too do not exist? Right? None of this stuff exists, so maybe he doesn't exist. No. If I convince myself of something or thought anything at all, then I certainly existed. But there is a deceiver of supreme power and cunning who is deliberately and constantly deceiving me. In that case, I too undoubtedly exist. If he is deceiving me, and let him deceive me as much as he can, he will never bring it about that I'm anything, that I'm nothing, so long as I think that I am something. So after considering everything very thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it's put forward by me or conceived in my mind. So there is this one thing that he can be certain of, even in the evil demon scenario. He thinks that he or we, anybody who thinks this through, is going to find that there is something that is not possible to doubt. You cannot doubt that you exist, right? If you're thinking, if you're considering the possibility that you're completely under an illusion, you can doubt everything, you doubt the existence of everything, but you're actually doubting. You're actually thinking. You're actually considering the possibility that we're under this radical illusion. Now, something interesting, he doesn't say, I exist, my body exists, right? Because he's really focusing on kind of thought alone. So when he examines what the I that exists is, he has to say that it's a thinking thing. Something that thinks exists. And he doesn't take this as immediately entailing the existence of the body, nor does it get into an external world immediately. What he thinks exists is the thing that's doubting, the thing that's thinking, a thinking thing, whatever that is. Right? So that's what he can be certain of. The cogito gets him in the position that he believes and he is certain that he, maybe he shouldn't even, anyway, a center of consciousness, a thinking thing, something thinking that exists, the thing that is doing the doubting. He's certain of it because it's impossible to doubt it. And again, it's not obvious to me whether he takes impossibility to doubt as a criterion of certainty or as the exact same thing as certain. Now, once he's done this, once he's torn everything down with the evil demon scenario and identified something he can be certain of, what to do now? Well, his project was actually to show that we have knowledge. So now what he has to do is rebuild. He needs to rebuild from a very narrow starting point. The narrow starting point is simply that he's certain of his own existence. And what he's going to want to do is show that there's an external world of which we're capable of having knowledge. And this isn't actually an easy task, right? If all you know is, I think, I'm certain that there is a thinking thing that exists, and that is not getting in a position yet of agreeing that there is an external world, because you've allowed that the external world can be completely doubted independently of this experience you're having of thinking. So merely saying that you exist, and committing yourself to your own existence because you're capable of thinking or doubting that you exist, that's not going to give you much to build on. And that's what he wants to do, is build on the basis of that, right? The question then is, how does he know this little bit that he knows? What is it that's distinctive of knowledge? I'm certain, he says, that I'm a thinking thing. Do I not therefore also know what is required from my being certain about anything, right? He's trying to figure out what it is that gives him certainty. He's identified something he knows, and now he's going to reflect upon it and try to work out what gives him that certainty. In this first item of knowledge, there is simply a clear and distinct perception of what I am asserting. This would not be enough to make me certain of the truth of the matter if it could ever turn out that something which I perceived with such clarity and distinctness was false. So now I seem to be able to lay it down as a general rule that whatever I perceive very clearly and distinctly is true. So this is what he proposes as the criterion of knowledge. When he reflects upon the cogito, when he reflects upon the fact that in thinking about whether he exists and doubting his own existence, he's persuaded that must be true. But why is he persuaded? Because he perceives it so clearly and distinctly. So that's the feature of that item of knowledge, which indicates, in a sense, the key to knowledge, the thing which is distinctive of when we have knowledge. Now, what is clear and distinct perception? As I read Descartes, he's not meaning clear and distinct perception to mean sensory perception. It appears to be some sort of cognitive or intellectual act, some sort of mental perception, some sort of intellectual perceiving, an act of the mind. He sometimes talks of the natural light of reason and that kind of thing. So it's not sensory experience, I don't think. And what's he mean by clarity and distinctness? Well, at one point he contrasts clarity with obscurity and distinctness with being confused. So he really is, he's trying to describe a certain kind of mental state, presumably one in which something just seems to be clearly and really decisively to be true. I'm not sure that he goes on elsewhere to describe in more detail what that is, but that's the way he seems to characterize clarity and distinctness in the Meditations. So he's taking clarity and distinctness of this kind of intellectual perception as the mark of certainty. But he's not prepared to help himself to beliefs about external objects just yet, right? You might think that he could say, well, I clearly distinctly perceive that there's some chairs. He doesn't do that. He wants to actually show that we have some reason to believe what our senses are telling us about the world. He's identified this characteristic of knowledge, but he doesn't think that he can apply clarity and distinctness of perception directly to sensory experience. So he has a kind of a indirect way that he has to go. In other words, he thinks he can be certain of certain kind of mental goings on, and that doesn't entail any degree of certainty about physical or external goings on. And he's not prepared to jump from clarity and distinctness of perception about what goes on sort of mentally to a view about the way things are in the world. So he has to prove the existence of an external world. And instead of doing it directly by saying, well, I see things in the external world, which is something we'll see next week G.E. Moore thinks you can do, what Descartes does is he gets involved in what you might think is a rather extravagant project of trying to prove the existence of God, who can then guarantee that there's an external world. And what he does is he thinks about the notion of God. And what he notices is that God is this idea of God is the idea of a perfect being. And he doesn't think that he could be the source of this idea. This idea of God couldn't have come from him because it's the idea of something perfect, and he's not perfect. So he thinks the idea of God must have come from God. God must exist because this idea couldn't have come from him. It must have come from somewhere. It must have come from the perfect being itself. So he must have got the idea of God from God. Couldn't be something that's sort of welled up inside his thoughts. And then because God is good, God is perfect, well, God would not have created a world in which we're subject to a massive illusion, right? God is good, not an evil demon. So he wouldn't have created a world like that. If he'd created a world of the kind that evil demon scenario describes, God would be a deceiver. But deceiving is not a good thing. God's perfect. So he can't be a deceiver. So Descartes concludes the external world exists. External world exists. God's not a deceiver, we're not under an illusion, so we can feel confident that when we're having experiences about the way the world is, that that is more or less the way they are. Now, I said this is not an easy project that he's trying to carry through, and one aspect of it is that at least one part of it seems to be quite deeply circular. And this is what's usually called the Cartesian circle. And it's been pointed out since Descartes himself was writing. He starts off by considering the cogito and arrives at the view that clear and distinct ideas are true. And he then uses this idea of clarity and distinctness of cognitive or intellectual perception as part of his argument for the existence of God. Right? He clearly and distinctly perceives that God must be perfect and must be the origin of his idea of God and so forth. So he takes the idea that clear and distinct ideas are true, uses them to argue for the existence of God, then he appeals to the existence of God to argue that God would guarantee that effectively that clear and distinct ideas are true. And so he looks like he uses clear and distinct ideas to argue for the existence of God and uses God to then underpin clarity and distinct ideas. So it looks like he's argued in a circle. And that's why, in a sense, Descartes kind of lands us in skepticism, because he creates this profound skeptical scenario and then seems to argue in a circle and trying to get out of it. And so in a sense, we're stuck with, he meant to use skepticism to show us that we have knowledge, but he left us with a profound problem of skepticism. And for the next 2 weeks, I'll be exploring ways in which we can respond to the skeptic. The first is that skeptics tend to work with some rather exacting standards for knowledge. They, in a sense, set the bar quite high. They typically assume, or at least skeptical scenarios typically assume, that certainty is required for knowledge. I mean, we certainly see Descartes working with something very close to a requirement of certainty for knowledge, because he's always talking about being able to doubt and being indubitable and so forth. Well, one response to the skeptic, known as fallibilism, is that humans are fallible and knowledge is fallible, and we don't need certainty for knowledge. And so one way of responding is just to say, look, the skeptic has set the bar way too high. We don't need to agree that certainty is required for knowledge. And if we just reject the requirement of certainty, then maybe we can be sure that we have knowledge, right? Second move I'm going to look at, famous move by the philosopher G.E. Moore, who does something that can seem to be begging the question against Descartes, or the external world skeptic. Some people just find this mind-numbingly simplistic, but others think it's a deep and basically sound response to the skeptic. Moore simply holds up a hand and says, here's one hand and here's another, and basically says, look, any argument you've got that these aren't hands has got to be resting on weaker assumptions than the simple belief that this is one hand and this is another, right? Any philosophical argument you've got for skepticism that's going to lead me to think that these aren't hands has got to rest on some challengeable, some questionable assumptions. So that's what we're going to look at next week. We've got some time for a few questions, if you like. Anything to do with skepticism would be a potential topic? Descartes? Nick?
What would Descartes say to Husserl, who said that he didn't do away with everything, so he kept logic and math?
Right. So he hasn't gone far enough.
Yeah, he still presupposed those two things and the validity of them. What would he say
And would that then undermine the cogito?
I don't know. I mean, Husserl had a problem with it, not
Right.
answering what Descartes would say, because
Yeah.
they would still be faulty axioms.
That's okay. So that then raises the question of the structure of when he does cogito ergo sum. You might think that because he expresses as cogito ergo sum, it's I think, therefore I am. You might think that it's an argument, and so you might think that he's assuming something like logic to carry the argument through, and so yeah, then that would be an appropriate objection. He's assuming logic, and he reasons. And he hadn't thrown that in the question, so he hadn't gone far enough. You might think that that is just a way of forming it. That makes it look like an argument. It might actually be a kind of a deep intuition that you have. Right? You might not be reasoning. You might just be recognizing that if you think, you exist. And then you might think it's deeper than, it doesn't require a stretch of reasoning.
Can you then say the same thing about intuition and saying that
You could, yep.
it's valid when it might not be?
But this might be some sort of really, okay, so you might think you're assuming that you can have this direct intuitive insight or something like that. Yep. And then I think Descartes would at that point say that this is something I'm not able to doubt. I don't know what Husserl says at that point. This is something I'm not able to doubt. And remember, Descartes seems to be thinking that indubitability is an indicator of certainty. But yeah, it could be challenged. Yeah, Shabir.
When Descartes says that his senses deceive him,
Yes.
I'm just wondering that, is it right to say his senses are deceiving him? Because wouldn't deception be where you have two perfectly similar situations and your senses deliver to your mind two different perceptions of them? Whereas we have, for instance, when you putting the stick into the water, it doesn't seem that's deception because that's a different sort of environmental
Right.
constraint, and it's expected that something different would happen. Whereas if you'd had two
Yeah.
perfectly similar situations.
So suppose that, I mean, I can see what you're saying, but suppose that when you look from out here, the experience you have is that the stick is not straight. And I guess the thought is if you consider that sense experience on its own, then, and for the moment, let's say, not say deceive, but it would lead you to form the belief that the stick is not straight. But then if you take into account other senses or other knowledge, you'd then be able to recognize that the stick is straight, right? And so I guess why you'd want to say the senses deceived you is if your inclination by looking at that without thinking about any other senses or any other knowledge you have, you would have come to the view that the stick was bent. And in that sense, it deceives you. But of course, it doesn't deceive you because we use other senses and other knowledge to explain that away. And we're going to give an explanation about refraction and whatever other things we say about why that's the case. But, I mean, I see what you're saying. The thought is that, I mean, in that case, you'd have the particular experience that is in some respects, I don't know, I'm inclined to say misleading, or you're...
Yeah, it's like, well, had I never known about the phenomenon, and this is the first time I put a stick into the water.
Yes.
Then I would think, well, let me try it again, like maybe a minute later.
Yeah.
Assuming that circumstances haven't changed, and I see the same thing, and then I would kind of expect that that's what happens, and there's some phenomenon that needs explaining. But cause that seems normal to me. For deception seems whereas you have two equal situations and different things.
Okay. Can we weaken it by saying that there are circumstances where our senses will lead us to form false beliefs? And then we get away from deceiving. I mean, and we can think about it. Surely there are cases where you have some kind of sense experience, and what that prompts is a belief that's mistaken. And later you're going to be able to see that it's mistaken. But under the circumstances, the experience leads you to have a false belief. On reflection, you're able to realize it isn't. Sorry, on reflection, you're able to realize that the belief is false and that there was some other explanation for it. I'm just wondering whether weakening it to forms a false belief or prompts a false belief gets away from your concern about deceiving. I mean, do you agree that sometimes we have mistaken beliefs, beliefs that are false? And sometimes these false beliefs can be produced by experience.
Yeah, I suppose like with that, because it's something so familiar to us, like water and the way it behaves.
Right.
Say, for instance, we were to discover some new phenomenon out there in the universe,
Right.
and we drew some conclusions somewhat hastily, and they
Yes.
were false. I guess in that situation, that's...
I would simply ask you for the next 24 hours, without sort of walking slowly or anything, but just to sort of monitor your life and notice whether there are times when you form a belief that you correct, that you then change. This will happen, for example, when you hear noises or reflections and so forth, shadows. And I think it's something that we just routinely do. We don't even think about it. As we go through the day, there are all sorts of little things that we're just kind of quickly correcting. And I mean, I think this is, we're not really disagreeing. You're saying that we don't form false beliefs because we correct so quickly. But there's a sense in which if you just stuck with the immediate sense experience and the immediate reaction to it, where you didn't sort of set it into a broader context, there would be a false belief that could have been brought about. And sometimes there will be.
Yeah, I think it's just the difference between saying our senses deceive us as opposed to saying our innate disposition to hastily make a conclusion.
Right, okay. Right. So it's fair enough. So you're inclined to sort of have the senses not doing any deceiving, but the belief that we form on the basis of the sense being a mistake. And that's an interesting thought, because that's the sort of a thought that fundamentally our senses are kind of right, but it's the cognitive process that comes afterwards that involves a mistake. I suppose then we could start playing around with funny kind of situations like the phantom limb sort of case. And there must be things that doctors can do to us by sort of scratching us in funny ways that get us to have funny sensations. Then you might wonder whether there are cases where the senses are kind of mistaken. But I agree with you that a lot of what's being called senses deceiving us is where we've formed a belief based on a sense experience, and the forming of the belief where the mistake sort of crept in. In a sense, when we looked at that, your way of thinking would be, we should not have formed the belief that it was a bent stick. Is that right?
Yeah, immediately when it seems like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts? Okay, so next week, for the next couple of weeks, we'll be thinking about various ways to respond to skepticism. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Steve.
See ya.